In the summer of 1936, a small man in a dark cloak stands at a microphone before the assembled representatives of 50 nations. He is slight, composed. His beard is trimmed close, his eyes steady in a way that suggests not calm exactly, but endurance. The particular stillness of someone who has already absorbed the worst around him. Italian journalists are screaming, blowing whistles, booing so loudly that guards have to physically remove several of them from the hall. The man at the microphone waits. He lets the noise wash over him. He does not flinch. He does not look toward the commotion. He stands there, one hand resting on the side of the podium, until the hall quiets. Then he begins to speak, not in French, which was the language of diplomacy, not in English, but in Amharic, his own language, the language of his country, which at that moment was being administered by a fascist viceroy whose forces had gassed and bombed it into submission less than 2 months before. His name was Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. He was there to ask the world why it had allowed his people to be destroyed. This is the story of that war, how it started, how it was fought, and what was done during it, that no army should ever be permitted to do. It is a story about two men who could not be more different. One of them commanded what was, at the time, one of the most technologically sophisticated militaries in Africa, and used it to gas civilians, bomb hospitals, and execute monks in an ancient mountain monastery. The other stood alone before the most powerful nations on earth and said, plainly and without theater, that he would not accept it. It is also a story about memory, specifically about humiliation and what happens when the leaders of a country decide that an old wound can only be healed by violence. To understand why Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, you have to go back nearly 40 years to a moment that Italians of a certain generation never fully got past. On the 1st of March, 1896, near a small town in the northern Ethiopian highlands called Adwa, an Italian colonial army of around 17,000 soldiers marched into battle against an Ethiopian force that outnumbered them more than 5 to 1. The Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, had been pushed into the attack by a furious telegram from Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, who had more or less accused him of cowardice for hesitating. Baratieri advanced 3 brigades through difficult terrain. In the dark, the columns got separated, lost contact with each other, and were hit from multiple directions by a disciplined, well-armed Ethiopian army under Emperor Menelik II. The result was a disaster. Between 6,000 and 7,000 Italian soldiers and Eritrean auxiliaries were killed in a single day. Nearly 4,000 were taken prisoner. All 3 Italian brigade commanders were either dead or wounded. Baratieri abandoned the field. When news reached Rome, Crispi resigned within days. Riots broke out in Milan, Livorno, and Naples. The humiliation was not merely military, it was psychological, because this was Africa, at a time when European powers had divided most of the continent between themselves and operated on the assumption that African armies were incapable of serious resistance. Adwa did not merely challenge that assumption, it demolished it. For Ethiopians, the victory meant independence. It meant that Ethiopia, alone among African nations except Liberia, would enter the 20th century without submitting to a European colonial power. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later that year, forced Italy to formally recognize Ethiopian sovereignty. The victory became a foundation of national identity, woven so deeply into Ethiopian consciousness that 40 years later, when the Italians came back, soldiers who had never met anyone who fought at Adwa still understood what it stood for. In Italy, the shame of Adwa did not dissolve. It went underground. It became one of those historical grievances that nationalist politicians kept alive. Because a grievance framed as an injustice waiting to be corrected is useful. It gives people a story about themselves that places them as the wronged party, the ones who are owed something. By the time Benito Mussolini arrived on the political scene, Adwa had been present in Italian nationalist consciousness for a quarter century. He came to power in 1922, appointed Prime Minister by King Victor Emmanuel III after his black shirts marched on Rome, an event somewhat less dramatic than it sounds, since the government was already crumbling and the march itself was partly theatre, but it worked. By the late 1920s, he had consolidated a one-party state. Political opponents were imprisoned, exiled, or murdered. The press was controlled. The courts were subordinated to the party. He had built around himself a cult of personality as Il Duce, the leader, projecting an image of vigor, decisiveness, and historical destiny that was partly real and partly elaborate stage management. He spoke from balconies to enormous crowds. He posed bare-chested for photographs. He wanted Italy to feel powerful, and he wanted the rest of Europe to treat it as a great power, which it was not quite, and which he knew it was not, and which bothered him continuously. His foreign policy ambitions were genuinely imperial in scope. He wanted Italy to control the Mediterranean basin, which he called Mare Nostrum, our sea, a phrase borrowed from ancient Roman rhetoric. He wanted colonies in Africa. He wanted to push Italian influence into the Balkans and the Middle East. He needed, for domestic reasons, to give the Italian public something to feel proud of, something large, something dramatic, something that could be presented as proof that fascism was delivering on its promises of national greatness. And he needed it because the Italian economy was struggling, and the political situation at home, beneath the propaganda, was never entirely stable. Ethiopia answered several problems at once. It was one of the very few African countries still outside European control. It sat geographically between two Italian territories, Eritrea to the north, Italian Somaliland to the southeast, which meant that controlling Ethiopia would give Italy a continuous belt of territory across the Horn of Africa. Italian engineers and military planners had been surveying Ethiopian terrain for years. Mussolini could frame the invasion as the long-delayed response to Adwa, which would be popular with the Italian public. He could frame it as a modernizing mission, bringing civilization and order to a backward country, which was the standard colonial language of the era. And he could frame it as strategic necessity, because Italy supposedly needed land for surplus population and resources for industrial growth. None of these justifications held up. Mussolini was not making arguments. He was managing a narrative. And the narrative he was building was about momentum, about power, about a strong leader doing what strong leaders do. He had begun preparing years before the incident that would provide the pretext. Italy had been quietly reinforcing its military presence in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, building roads, establishing supply dumps, improving the ports through which troops and equipment would flow. Italian military planners had studied the mistakes of 1896 carefully. They had noted how Baratieri's columns lost cohesion in mountain terrain, how the supply situation had been mismanaged, how Italian commanders had underestimated Ethiopian numbers and capability. This time, Italy would come with overwhelming force: aircraft, tanks, artillery, and, though it was not spoken aloud in the planning documents, chemical weapons. The pretext arrived in November 1934 at a place called Wal Wal. Wal Wal was an oasis in a desert border region between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland. The exact boundary in that area had never been formally agreed upon. The terrain was remote and the demarcation imprecise, and Italy had exploited this ambiguity to build a small fort there, garrisoned by Somali troops under Italian officers. The Ethiopians regarded the area as their territory, a position supported by most of the available cartographic evidence. In late November 1934, an Anglo-Ethiopian boundary commission arrived in the region with a military escort. The Italian garrison refused to allow them to proceed. There was a standoff that lasted several days, and on December 5th, a firefight broke out. The precise circumstances remained disputed. Both sides had incentives to characterize events in their favor, and the witnesses disagreed. What is clear is the outcome. Roughly 150 Ethiopians were killed, along with 2 Italian officers. Mussolini's government responded with demands for a formal apology, a salute to the Italian flag, and financial reparations. The Ethiopian government appealed to the League of Nations, arguing that the fort at Walwal was on Ethiopian territory and that Italy had been the aggressor. The League of Nations investigated. Months later, it delivered a verdict that remains, even by the standards of international institutional timidity, remarkable in its uselessness. It exonerated both sides. Neither party was found to bear primary responsibility. This conclusion required either a degree of diplomatic dishonesty or a complete abdication of analytical judgment, because the basic facts were not seriously in doubt. Italy had built a fort inside disputed Ethiopian territory and had refused to allow a legitimate international boundary commission to proceed. But the League's 2 dominant powers, Britain and France, were more concerned about Italian alignment in European politics than about Ethiopian sovereignty. They were actively trying to keep Mussolini on the right side of a potential conflict with Germany. The Ethiopian case was, in the quiet corridors of European diplomacy, a secondary matter. Mussolini took the League's passivity as an opening and accelerated his preparations. By the summer of 1935, the build-up in Eritrea and Somaliland had reached a scale visible to anyone paying attention. 500,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, close to 600 aircraft. It was not a border policing operation. It was a full invasion force, assembled in plain sight, and the world's major powers, despite occasional expressions of concern, looked away. While Mussolini built his army in the heat of the East African coastal lowlands, the man he intended to destroy was doing everything within his means to stop what was coming. Haile Selassie had been born on July 23, 1892, in a small village outside Harar, in the eastern highlands of Ethiopia. His birth name was Tafari Makonnen. His father was Ras Makonnen Fulda Mikhail, a trusted commander and cousin of Emperor Menelik II, the same Menelik who would win at Adwa 4 years after Tafari's birth. His family was part of the old nobility, with lineage that traced back, by tradition, through centuries of Ethiopian Christian kingship all the way to the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a lineage Selassie took seriously, and which gave his rule a theological weight in the eyes of his people. That was difficult to separate from political authority. He lost his mother before he was 2 years old. He was educated partly by Catholic missionaries in Harar and partly by private tutors, absorbing French alongside Amharic, developing an early habit of meticulous administration and an unusual capacity for absorbing complex information and acting on it patiently. He was physically slight throughout his life, fine-boned, not imposing in the way that military commanders are expected to be. His power was always more about precision than size. By the time he was 13, he had been appointed governor of a district. By 24, he was regent, the de facto ruler of Ethiopia, operating under the nominal authority of Empress Zawditu, the daughter of Menelik, who had been placed on the throne in 1916 after the previous heir was deposed for converting to Islam. The relationship between Selassie and the Empress was a delicate, sometimes tense coexistence. She was conservative, deeply religious, suspicious of his modernizing ambitions. He was determined to transform Ethiopia into a state that the rest of the world would have to take seriously. For nearly 14 years, they governed in managed tension, each checking the other until Zawditu's death in 1930, under circumstances that were never entirely explained, cleared the path for Selassie's coronation. He was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I on November 2, 1930. The coronation was attended by representatives of most major nations, covered by international press, photographed and filmed. He had deliberately invited the world to watch because he understood that visibility was a form of protection. An Ethiopia the world knew was an Ethiopia that was harder to casually destroy. Throughout his years as regent and then emperor, he pushed Ethiopia toward the modern world with considerable persistence. He secured Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations in 1923, partly by publicly committing to abolish slavery, a practice that existed at scale in Ethiopia and which he addressed with genuine legislation, though implementation was uneven in the rural areas. He traveled to Europe and the Middle East in 1924, becoming the first Ethiopian ruler to go abroad, visiting capitals from Jerusalem to London to Geneva, cultivating relationships and studying what the industrialized world had produced. He established the first Ethiopian constitution in 1931. He founded the Bank of Ethiopia. He built schools, encouraged newspapers, and sent promising young Ethiopians abroad for education. He was not a democrat by any measurement. The 1931 constitution centralized power firmly under his authority, and he was not inclined to share it. He could be ruthless with political rivals. But within the frame of what was possible for an ancient empire trying to maintain its independence, in a world dominated by European industrial powers, he was doing something unusual. He was trying to build a state that could defend itself. He watched the Italian build-up with clear eyes. Beginning in 1934, he appealed repeatedly to the League of Nations, warning that Italy was preparing an invasion, asking for arbitration, asking for support, asking for arms. The League debated, the League discussed, the League formed committees. Britain and France quietly signaled to Mussolini that they expected some kind of diplomatic solution, which Mussolini interpreted correctly as confirmation that they would not act decisively to prevent a war. Ethiopia received almost no military assistance. The arms embargo that the League imposed on both parties in the lead-up to the conflict, intended to demonstrate even-handedness, hit Ethiopia far harder than Italy, because Italy had already stockpiled everything it needed. Ethiopia was still trying to modernize its military when the embargo closed the supply chains it depended on. The Ethiopian army numbered, by various estimates, somewhere between 350,000 and 760,000 men when mobilization was complete in the fall of 1935. The wide range reflects the nature of the force. It was built around regional levies commanded by provincial nobles, not a standardized modern army with consistent organization and equipment. Many soldiers carried spears. Others had rifles, many of them obsolete, some dating back to the 1896 war. There were some modern weapons among the more elite units, a small number of tanks, a handful of aircraft, some artillery, a small number of foreign advisors. Anti-fascist volunteers from Europe and America provided technical expertise and tactical guidance, often at enormous personal risk. Mussolini had 599 to 800 tanks against Ethiopia's 4. He had 595 aircraft against Ethiopia's 13. he had 2,000 artillery pieces against Ethiopia's 200. He had a professional modern army trained in combined arms operations, with reliable logistics, radio communications, and air support that could be called on within minutes. When you line those numbers up, the word war starts to feel generous. Wars have two sides. What does it mean to fight something like this anyway? Is it courage, or is it something we don't have a word for yet? On the night of October 2nd, 1935, Haile Selassie issued his proclamation to the Ethiopian people. He called them to arms. He acknowledged what they faced. He offered no false comfort about the outcome. He said, in essence, we are going to fight, regardless. Before dawn the following morning, Italian forces crossed the Ethiopian border on two fronts simultaneously, and the war began. In the north, Marshal Emilio de Bono led a massive army out of Eritrea, crossing the Mareb River with Italian infantry, Eritrean colonial troops, tanks, artillery, and close air support. No declaration of war had been made, no ultimatum delivered. In the southeast, General Rodolfo Graziani pushed northward from Italian Somaliland with a second force, threatening to drive deep into the Ogaden region. The symbolic geography of the Italian advance was not lost on anyone. Among the first objectives was Adwa itself, the town synonymous with Italy's greatest colonial defeat. De Bono took it within days. The Italians moved through Adwa and continued on, taking the ancient city of Axum, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Africa, a place of immense spiritual significance to Ethiopian Christians, believed to house the original Ark of the Covenant in its famous church. By early November, they had reached Mekelle, the principal city of the Tigray region, roughly 120 kilometers inside Ethiopia. Mussolini watched the pace of advance with impatience. De Bono was a careful, methodical commander who wanted to consolidate supply lines before pushing further into the highland interior, which was difficult terrain and easily defensible. Mussolini wanted speed. He wanted Ethiopia subdued before the international situation could generate serious consequences. He replaced De Bono in November 1935 with Pietro Badoglio, a harder man, a veteran of multiple colonial campaigns, who understood that Mussolini wanted results and was prepared to achieve them without excessive concern for the methods involved. The League of Nations, to its credit and somewhat to Mussolini's irritation, did respond to the invasion. On November 18, 1935, economic sanctions were imposed on Italy by a vote of 50 member states, with only Italy voting against and Austria, Hungary, and Albania abstaining. Italy was prohibited from selling its products abroad. Member states were barred from exporting certain raw materials and arms to Italy, and from extending credit to Italian businesses. The sanctions were notable for what they deliberately excluded. Oil was not sanctioned. Coal was not sanctioned. The Suez Canal, through which Italian supply ships were continuously sailing to East Africa, was not closed. There's a particular kind of cowardice that dresses itself up as diplomacy. This was it. The Laval Pact, a secret Anglo-French proposal to effectively partition Ethiopia and give Mussolini most of what he wanted, was leaked to the press in December 1935 and caused such outrage in Britain and France that both governments had to disavow it. British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare resigned in the fallout. But the episode revealed exactly how far Britain and France were willing to go in accommodating Italian aggression. The sanctions were designed to demonstrate disapproval without actually stopping the war. They stung. They did not bite where it mattered. In December 1935, Ethiopian commanders launched the Christmas Offensive, a coordinated counterattack designed to halt the Italian advance, test Italian defenses, and demonstrate to the watching world that Ethiopia was capable of sustained, organized resistance. Close to 250,000 fighters mobilized across multiple fronts in the north. At Dembagina Pass in the Tembian region, Ethiopian forces under Ras Imru achieved a genuine tactical victory, routing a column of roughly 1,000 Eritrean troops under Italian command. The pass was held. The Italians retreated. Then Badoglio deployed. What the Ethiopian army had no answer for. Mustard gas, sulfur mustard, wiperite, the yellow-green oil that had haunted the Western Front in the First World War. It is not a quick weapon. It does not kill immediately like high explosive. It burns. It blisters. It works on skin and eyes and the delicate tissue of lungs and throats with methodical persistence. Men exposed to it develop massive fluid-filled blisters across any uncovered skin. Their eyes swell shut. Their airways constrict and fill. They may take days to die, during which they are in constant pain and almost completely incapacitated. I want to stop here for a second, because I think we read the word gas, and our brains file it under history. These were people wading through fields, farmers, soldiers who had never left their own highlands. They didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late. Italy had ratified the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the international agreement prohibiting chemical weapons in warfare, on April 3, 1928. 7 years later, Mussolini ordered it used against Ethiopia. The deployment began gradually. There were reports, possibly credible though not definitively confirmed, of chlorine gas being used in southern Ethiopia as early as October 1935. In December 1935, Italian aircraft dropped tear gas and asphyxiating gas over the Takazi Valley in northeastern Ethiopia. Beginning in late January and February 1936, the use of mustard gas became systematic and large-scale. Italian aircraft dropped specially designed bombs, large canisters containing liquid sulfur mustard, over Ethiopian positions, over water sources, over grazing lands, over villages that had no military significance. The liquid spread on impact, settled into the ground, clung to vegetation, and accumulated in hollows and water pools. It evaporated slowly into a vapor that drifted at ground level through the air. Ethiopian soldiers who walked through contaminated areas without protective equipment, who had no protective equipment, who had never encountered chemical weapons, who in many cases did not understand what was happening to them, absorbed the agent through their bare skin, their eyes, their lungs. Reports from Red Cross physicians working with Ethiopian forces documented the effects with clinical precision and barely concealed horror. Dr. John Melly, a British doctor serving with the Ethiopian Red Cross, wrote about treating men whose entire skin surface had become a landscape of raw, weeping tissue. Not soldiers hit by shrapnel or bullets. Men who had simply walked through a field after an Italian aircraft passed overhead and dropped its cargo. Ethiopian appeals to the League of Nations included detailed medical testimony from European physicians who had witnessed the effects. The evidence was not ambiguous or contested. It was documented in exhaustive and terrible detail. Haile Selassie himself, in his speech to the League of Nations 6 months later, described what he had seen and what had been reported to him. He spoke about Italian aircraft hurling barrels of liquid onto his armies. He described soldiers scattering to avoid the gas, civilians wading through contaminated rivers and emerging with burning skin they initially could not explain, women carrying children on their backs who were burned. He described the psychological effect as well. The particular terror of a weapon that cannot be seen coming, cannot be outrun, and cannot be treated if you survive the initial exposure. The Italians also bombed Red Cross hospitals and ambulances, repeatedly. The International Red Cross facilities operating with Ethiopian forces flew their identifying symbols clearly, large red crosses on white backgrounds, visible from the air. Italian pilots bombed them anyway, on multiple documented occasions, across multiple locations. Some historians have treated this as incidental, the confusion of fast-moving aerial warfare. The pattern and frequency make that explanation difficult to sustain. No Italian officer was ever disciplined for it. Between 300 and 500 tons of mustard gas, by most researchers' estimates, were used by Italian forces in Ethiopia. Italy would not officially acknowledge this until 1996, 60 years after the fact. Against this, the Ethiopian army did everything that courage, bint, and tactical skill could do. At the First Battle of Tembian in January 1936, Ethiopian forces under Ras Kassar fought the Italians to a grinding standstill and achieved initial gains. But Badoglio's air power and his use of mustard gas to break up concentrated Ethiopian formations gradually eroded whatever advantage the terrain or Ethiopian numbers might have provided. The Battle of Amba Aradam in mid-February 1936 was decisive and costly. Badoglio encircled an Ethiopian army under Ras Mulugeta Yegazu, one of Ethiopia's most experienced commanders, in the Amba Aradam Massif, a great flat-topped mountain that should have been a natural fortress. Under sustained aerial bombardment, and with mustard gas deployed to prevent organized withdrawal, the Ethiopian position disintegrated. Ras Mulugeta was killed in the retreat, either in the fighting or in an ambush on the mountain tracks below. He was not a young man. He died in the mountains of his own country, and his army was largely destroyed around him. The Second Battle of Tembian in late February ended in decisive Italian victory. Ethiopian forces in the northern theatre were no longer capable of organized resistance on any significant scale. The Battle of Shire in early March saw the last coherent Ethiopian armies in the north broken apart under continued aerial and chemical bombardment. On March 31, 1936, Badoglio's forces met what remained of the Ethiopian army in the north at Mechu, and Haile Selassie himself was present at the front. There are accounts, not all of them verifiable, but consistent enough to seem credible, of the emperor personally manning an anti-aircraft gun during Italian air raids. Whether or not that specific detail is accurate, his presence at Mechu was real, and its significance was real. He was not a commander who had sent his people to die while remaining safely distant. He came. The Ethiopians at Mechu fought against fortified Italian positions that were being continuously resupplied and reinforced by air. They attacked. They attacked again. The Imperial Guard was broken. When it became clear that the position could not be held and that his army was dissolving around him, Haile Selassie ordered the retreat south toward Addis Ababa. The road back was a separate kind of ordeal. Italian aircraft followed the retreating columns for days, bombing and strafing without pause. Mustard gas had contaminated water sources along the route through the highlands. Men who had survived the battle drank from streams that would burn them from within. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a desperate struggle to reach the capital, before the army ceased to exist entirely as a fighting force. In early May 1936, Addis Ababa began to come apart. Word moved through the city ahead of the retreating soldiers that the battle was lost, that the emperor was coming back defeated, that the Italians were on their way. Looting broke out as people stripped warehouses and shops before the conquerors could claim them. Mobs moved through the streets. Fires were set. Foreign residents barricaded themselves inside their legations and embassies. The careful modern capital that Haile Selassie had spent years building, the banks and schools and government ministries, descended in days into disorder. On May 2nd, Haile Selassie made his decision. He could not defend the city. He had no army capable of defending it. He could stay and be captured or killed, which would achieve nothing except giving Mussolini a propaganda trophy. He could try to continue fighting as a guerrilla, and some of his advisors pressed him too, but his presence in Ethiopia also made him a target that would draw disproportionate Italian violence toward any area he occupied. His continued existence as a recognized sovereign, as the legitimate emperor of Ethiopia, still speaking at the League of Nations, still recognized by most of the world's governments, was potentially more valuable than anything he could accomplish with a rifle in the mountains. He boarded a train to Djibouti, taking his family and a small group of officials. From Djibouti, he sailed to Palestine, where he spent a few days in Jerusalem before sailing on to England. He arrived in June 1936 and settled in Bath, a city in the west of England, known for its Roman ruins, its medieval abbey, and its warm springs. Bath, a spa town in western England, the Emperor of Ethiopia in exile, in Bath. I don't know whether to find that absurd or heartbreaking, maybe both. The streets of Bath were not entirely indifferent to him. When he arrived, crowds came to see him, ordinary British citizens lining the pavements, some cheering, some simply watching with curiosity or sympathy. His presence was covered by the press. He was a figure of considerable moral weight to many people who followed international affairs, and his exile in a pleasant English spa town was understood by most observers as exactly what it was: a decent country's failure to do more than offer a dispossessed emperor somewhere to live quietly. Pietro Badoglio's forces entered Addis Ababa on May 5, 1936. 3 days later, Mussolini formally announced the annexation of Ethiopia and the creation of Italian East Africa, Africa Orientale Italiana, merging Ethiopia with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland into a single colonial territory. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy was proclaimed Emperor of Ethiopia. Mussolini, from a balcony at the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, announced to a crowd that filled the piazza and spilled into the surrounding streets that Italy finally had its empire. The crowd roared. It had been 40 years since Adwa. Then, on the 30th of June, 1936, the Italian delegation to the League of Nations was quietly withdrawn, and Haile Selassie walked into the Assembly Hall in Geneva. He had travelled from Bath to London and then to Geneva at the end of that June, and the reaction in the streets had been remarkable. Crowds gathered to watch his car pass. People pressed forward to see him. He was not yet a figure of religious reverence that would develop more fully in Jamaica and the Caribbean over the following decades. But he was already something close to a symbol, the man who had lost everything and was still present, still standing, still asking for justice. When he arrived at the Assembly Hall, Italian journalists were waiting for him. They jeered and whistled when his name was announced. Several had to be removed by guards. The disruption was apparently coordinated, an attempt to prevent the speech from proceeding or to undermine it by making it appear to begin in chaos. It did not work. Selassie waited, as he had waited through worse. And when the noise subsided, he spoke. He spoke for close to an hour in Amharic, with a French interpreter. He described the chemical weapons in specific clinical terms, the barrels of liquid hurled from aircraft, the blisters, the contaminated water, the civilians who had not understood what was happening to them until it was too late. He described the bombing of Red Cross hospitals by name and location. He described the destruction of villages with no military significance. He described what he had seen personally at the front. He presented himself not as a supplicant begging for charity, but as a member state of the League of Nations, appearing before the organization to demand that its charter be enforced, which was his right, because it was precisely what the League had promised to every member state that joined. He asked the assembled governments what the League of Nations was actually for. Ethiopia had joined the League. Ethiopia had brought its grievances through the proper procedures. Ethiopia had accepted arbitration processes and waited for results. Italy, also a member, had invaded anyway, without a declaration of war, using weapons banned by international treaty, bombing hospitals, killing civilians. Italy now controlled the country. He asked, not rhetorically, but with genuine directness, what answer he should take back to his people. Then he said something that would be quoted for the rest of the century. He told the assembled nations that if the League permitted this to stand, if it allowed a member state to destroy another member state with chemical weapons and face no meaningful consequences, then the precedent had been set. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. He was speaking to the European nations. He was telling them that the system of collective security they had built after the First World War, which was supposed to make aggressive war too costly to be worth undertaking, was only as strong as their willingness to enforce it. If they abandoned it here, for their own political convenience, they were telling any government willing to listen that aggression pays. He was asking them to understand that the precedent they were setting in a distant African country would not stay there. 3 years later, Germany invaded Poland. The practical result of the speech, in the immediate term, was meager. The League of Nations voted on the question of recognizing Italian sovereignty over Ethiopia. 23 against, 1 in favor, 25 abstentions. This produced no concrete action. Sanctions were already being wound down and would be formally lifted in July. Ethiopia's seat in the League remained attributed to Haile Selassie. The Italian conquest was never formally recognized by the organization, which was a moral gesture, but not a military one. He returned to Bath with no support, no army, and no clear timeline for return. The speech itself, however, traveled. It was reproduced by newspapers across the world. It was broadcast. In the United States, the black press, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, had been following the Ethiopian war with intense and sustained attention since before it began. The invasion of Ethiopia was not experienced by African Americans as a distant geopolitical event, but as something personal, something directly connected to the larger history of white European power exercising itself against black populations. When 100,000 people demonstrated against the Italian invasion in Harlem in August 1935, before a single bomb had been dropped, marching down Lenox Avenue with signs and chants, they were expressing something that had nothing to do with Ethiopian domestic politics, and everything to do with what the war represented. In Jamaica and the Caribbean, Haile Selassie's survival and his speech resonated within a religious and cultural movement that had been growing since the early 1930s. The Rastafari movement, which had taken his pre-coronation name, Rastafari, as its own, identified him as a messianic figure, the fulfillment of Marcus Garvey's statement that Africans should look to their homeland for the crowning of a black king. His coronation in 1930 had been covered internationally, photographed and filmed and reproduced in newspapers worldwide, and among certain communities it had landed with the force of revelation. His refusal to disappear quietly after the fall of Addis Ababa, his appearance at Geneva, his bearing in exile, all of it deepened and intensified that identification. He had not been destroyed. He was still there. This is not how military historians typically write about wars, but it is part of what this war actually meant, and leaving it out would be a distortion. And honestly, this is the part I keep coming back to. The geopolitics, the troop movements, the League votes, those matter. But 100,000 people marching down Lenox Avenue before a single bomb dropped? That's people telling you what something means, louder than any archive can. While Haile Selassie waited in Bath and gave interviews and wrote letters and worked every diplomatic channel available to him, Ethiopia endured 5 years of Italian occupation that were not, by any measurement, gentle. Rodolfo Graziani was appointed Viceroy and Governor-General of Ethiopia. He had a record in Italian Libya of methods that could be described, without exaggeration, as systematic terror. Collective reprisals against civilian populations, mass executions of suspected resistors, the destruction of entire communities. He brought those methods to Ethiopia, applied with the same logic. That any population which might conceivably support resistance must be made to fear supporting it, more than they feared anything else. The Ethiopian resistance, known as the Arbegnoch, or Patriots, had begun within days of the Italian occupation and never stopped. They operated in the forests and mountains. They attacked Italian convoys. They ambushed supply columns. They harassed garrisons in towns where Italian authority was theoretically complete. They received almost nothing from outside. No significant weapons resupply. No foreign fighters in quantity. No money. They kept fighting anyway, year after year, with captured Italian weapons and whatever they could make or find. The highlands were never truly pacified. The Italians controlled the towns and the main roads. The rest of Ethiopia, the vast majority of the country's territory, remained contested. On February 19, 1937, 2 young Ethiopian men named Abraha Deboch and Moges Asgedom threw grenades into a crowd at an official ceremony in Addis Ababa, where Graziani was presiding. He was wounded but survived. What followed was among the worst single episodes of the entire occupation. For 3 days, Italian soldiers, police, and irregular fascist black-shirt militiamen moved through the streets of Addis Ababa, killing anyone they could find. Homes were burned. People were dragged out and beaten or shot. The estimates of deaths range from several hundred to several thousand. The records were not carefully kept, which may itself be informative. This became known as the Graziani Massacre, and it was followed by a period of organized reprisal that extended to areas far outside the capital. In May 1937, Italian forces descended on the monastery of Debre, Libanos, one of the most sacred sites in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, founded in the 13th century, a center of learning and religious life that had survived countless centuries of regional conflict. The monks and clergy were accused of sheltering members of the resistance. The abbot and approximately 297 monks were taken out and executed. Further killings of clergy and associated civilians continued over the following days. Some estimates of the total dead exceed 1,000. The monastery itself survived, but the community it had housed for centuries was largely destroyed. That was the occupation. In Bath, Haile Selassie received news of these events through whatever channels remained available to him. He wrote, he appealed, he traveled when he was permitted to, gave speeches, met with diplomats and journalists. He was a man in limbo, the internationally recognized emperor of a country he was not in, dealing with a political situation in which the major powers of Europe had more or less concluded that Ethiopia was a lost cause, and that accommodating Mussolini was worth more than reversing what had been done. He was patient. He had no real choice but to be patient. On June 10, 1940, Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. He had watched the German army move through Poland in September 1939, through Denmark and Norway in April 1940, through the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg in May 1940, and into France through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes. France had fallen in 6 weeks, with the British army evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, leaving most of its heavy equipment behind. Mussolini had concluded, with what seemed at the time like reasonable logic, that Hitler was going to win the war. He wanted to be on the winning side, which he calculated required him to actually be in the war, and he declared it. For Haile Selassie, this was the development he had been waiting for. Not because he was grateful for the German victories that had created this situation. He wasn't. But because it changed the strategic calculation for Britain in a way that nothing else had managed to do. Suddenly, Italian East Africa was enemy territory. Italian forces in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland were now a threat to British positions in Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and British Somaliland. The Red Sea, through which British supplies moved to Egypt and beyond, ran between territories that were now in Italian hands on both sides. The liberation of Ethiopia had abruptly become a British military priority, in a way that Ethiopian justice and Haile Selassie's speeches had never achieved. Britain agreed to support his return. Haile Selassie had maintained contact throughout his exile with the patriot resistance inside Ethiopia, with the networks of Arbegnach commanders who were still fighting in the highlands and forests. He had information about their positions, their capabilities, their chains of command. He was not a figurehead being carried along by British military planning. He was the political and organizational center around which a coordinated liberation campaign could be built. When the British advance entered Ethiopian territory, it would be accompanied by legitimate political authority, not merely foreign conquest. On January 20th, 1941, Haile Selassie crossed back into Ethiopia. He came in from Sudan through the western borderlands with a mixed force of British officers, Sudanese regular troops, Ethiopian exiles who had been organizing in Sudan and Egypt, and patriot fighters who had crossed the border to join him. The British unit that coordinated much of the irregular side of the operation was called Gideon Force, commanded by a deeply unconventional British officer named Ord Wingate. Wingate had developed his thinking about irregular warfare in Palestine and believed with genuine conviction that small, fast-moving forces operating with surprise and psychological pressure could achieve effects far beyond what their numbers should logically allow. He was right about this. Gideon Force, which numbered only a few thousand men at its peak, moved through western Ethiopia with remarkable speed, liberating towns, disrupting Italian supply lines, and triggering surrenders that cascaded as Italian morale deteriorated. The Italian garrison in Ethiopia was large on paper, around 300,000 men in the combined theater of East Africa, but many of them were colonial troops recruited from Eritrea, Somalia, and other territories, with limited attachment to the cause they were notionally defending. The Italian officer corps was uneven. Supply lines to East Africa had been cut off when Britain closed the Mediterranean to Axis shipping, which meant that everything the Italian garrison needed had to come the long way around Africa, or not at all. And the Ethiopian patriots, who had been fighting for 5 years without outside support, were suddenly no longer alone. The psychological effect of that, of the emperor himself crossing back into Ethiopia and the British army advancing on 3 fronts, was significant. British forces advanced simultaneously from multiple directions. From Kenya, General Alan Cunningham led a Commonwealth force northward through Italian Somaliland toward Addis Ababa, in a campaign notable for its speed, covering enormous distances in weeks. From the north, British and Indian forces pushed into Eritrea, fighting the Battle of Keren, which was the stiffest resistance Italy mounted in the entire East African campaign. The Italian garrison at Keren held for nearly 2 months before the position was turned, and the road to Asmara and then to Addis Ababa was opened. On April 6, 1941, British Commonwealth troops entered Addis Ababa. The Italian administration had already largely evacuated. Italian resistance continued in some mountain strongholds. The Duke of Aosta, Prince Amedeo of Savoy, who had been Viceroy of Italian East Africa since 1937, retreated with the remnants of his forces to the mountain fortress of Amba Alagi near the Eritrean border. He held out for several weeks before surrendering on May 17th with formal military honors, which the British granted. He died as a prisoner of war in 1942 from illness contracted during the siege. The last significant Italian forces in East Africa at Gondar held out until November 1941. By May 5, 1941, the outcome was not in doubt. Haile Selassie chose the date of his return to Addis Ababa with care. May 5, 1941. Exactly 5 years to the day after Badoglio's army had entered the city. He entered the capital accompanied by the Arbegnons, the patriots who had fought without ceasing through 5 years of occupation, and by British officers and Commonwealth soldiers and Ethiopian exile fighters. The streets were full. People had waited through occupation and massacre and hunger and loss for this moment. And when it arrived, it appears to have been received as something approaching the miraculous. His speech on that day was brief and plain. He said that the people had been freed from foreign servitude. He said the day would be commemorated as a great Ethiopian anniversary. He said, "Today is the day on which we defeated our enemy." He was 48 years old. He had been in exile for 5 years, 1 month and 3 days. The war and its aftermath left marks that took decades to trace. For the League of Nations, the Ethiopian War was not the killing blow. The organization continued through the rest of the 1930s and into the war, but it conclusively demonstrated that the League could not do what it had been created to do. When a member state used chemical weapons against another member state, bombed its hospitals, massacred its clergy, and the League imposed partial sanctions that excluded oil, left the Suez Canal open, and lifted the measures within a year. The message was clear enough. The League mattered when great powers wanted it to, and it could be ignored when they didn't. It was dissolved in 1946 and replaced by the United Nations, an organization built partly on lessons drawn from the League's failures, though not entirely successfully. For Mussolini, the Ethiopian Empire turned out to be less useful than he had imagined. The occupation was expensive, never fully pacified, a drain on resources that Italy could not easily afford. The war had revealed weaknesses in Italian military logistics and industrial capacity that would become catastrophic once Italy was genuinely drawn into a wider conflict. The combined financial and material cost of Ethiopia and subsequent Italian intervention in the Spanish Civil War left the Italian armed forces considerably less capable than their paper strength suggested. When Italy formally entered the Second World War in June 1940, those weaknesses were exposed almost immediately. By the following year, the East African Empire had been lost. By 1943, Italy itself had surrendered. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini was shot by Italian partisans near Lake Como while attempting to flee to Switzerland. His body, and those of several of his associates, were brought to Milan and hung upside down by their ankles from the roof of a gas station in the Piazzale Loreto. the same square where, the previous year, 15 Italian partisans had been publicly executed by fascist forces. He had stood on a balcony in Rome in May 1936 and told the cheering crowd that Italy finally had its empire. Haile Selassie ruled Ethiopia until 1974, when he was deposed in a military coup led by a Marxist faction called the Derg. The manner of his death, on August 27, 1975, remains disputed. The military government at the time claimed natural causes. Evidence that emerged later, taken seriously by researchers, though certainty is not possible, suggested he had been strangled on orders from the regime. He was 83 years old. His remains were found in 1992 beneath a concrete slab on the grounds of the palace, and were finally reinterred with imperial honors at the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa in 2000. Between his return in 1941 and his deposition in 1974, he remained a significant figure in African and international politics. He helped found the Organization of African Unity in 1963, a continental body for African nations headquartered in Addis Ababa, with Ethiopia's role as its founding location directly connected to the moral standing Selassie had accumulated during the war years and after. He secured Ethiopia's place in the United Nations. He was recognized and taken seriously in international forums, in a way that was partly a consequence of having stood in Geneva in 1936 and refused to be a casualty of convenience. His record as a domestic ruler is more complicated. He was not a democrat. The feudal land system persisted under his rule with limited reform, and Ethiopia's rural poor, the majority of the country's population, saw little of the modernization that the capital experienced. His critics argued that he concentrated power and wealth too narrowly and moved too slowly on structural reform. When drought struck in 1972 and 1973, his government's inadequate response contributed to a famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people and was a direct factor in the political conditions that enabled the coup against him. These failures are real, and they matter, and they exist alongside everything else that is true about him. The question of Italian accountability for what was done in Ethiopia was never properly addressed. No Italian officer or official was ever tried or punished for the use of mustard gas, for the bombing of Red Cross hospitals, for the Graziani Massacre, or for the massacre at Debre, Libanos. In the post-war settlement, Italy's usefulness as an anti-communist partner in the new Cold War order was considered more important than any reckoning with its colonial crimes. The Allied war crimes trials focused primarily on Germany and Japan. Italy received, in relative terms, a light treatment. Italy officially acknowledged that it had used chemical weapons in Ethiopia only in 1996, 60 years after the fact. The question of reparations has never been resolved. The image of Haile Selassie in Geneva in 1936 carries a particular weight if you consider what it actually represented. He had done everything right, by the rules the international community had set for itself. He had joined the League of Nations. He had brought his country's grievances through proper channels. He had accepted arbitration processes and waited for results. He had appealed for arms, for intervention, for any form of support. He had appeared personally before the League Assembly, the first head of state in history to do so, and made his case in his own language, with the precision of a man who had been at the front and seen what was happening to his country. He had asked for justice, in a room full of people who had the power to provide at least a version of it and chose not to. None of it produced the result he needed. The speech was heard nonetheless. It crossed oceans. It was carried in newspapers in Harlem and Kingston and Lagos and Nairobi and Cape Town. The image of a man standing at a microphone while foreign journalists screamed at him, refusing to move, refusing to speak any language but his own, refusing to behave like someone who had already accepted defeat. That image did not fade. It carried through the African diaspora, through the anti-colonial movements of the 1950s and 1960s, through decades of struggle for political independence and human dignity that drew, in ways both direct and indirect, on the moral example of a man who had stood in Geneva with no army behind him and said, "I will not pretend this is acceptable." History does not always deliver justice, not on schedule, not reliably, not in the forms we would choose. Sometimes it delivers nothing that looks like justice at all, and the people who did terrible things retire in comfort, while the people they damaged try to rebuild from what remains. That happens. It happens often, but sometimes not always, not predictably, not as a rule you can count on. The long arc bends a little. The man who needed an empire to prove something about himself ended up upside down in a Milanese piazza. The man who walked into the League of Nations with nothing walked back into his capital 5 years later with his head still RP. And I think that's the hardest thing to sit with. Not the villains getting their comeuppance, but all the people who never got anything. The monks at Debre, Libanos, the soldiers who drank from contaminated streams. History remembered Selassie. It didn't remember them. That is not a guarantee of anything. It does not undo the mustard gas, or the massacres, or the years of occupation, or the weight of all the people who died. But it is the way this particular story ended. And it is worth knowing.